actually like a lot of Bultmann's work, and I like the sparkiness, I like the originality of it, but yeah, for me, this idea that the gospel writers were just people who really just one step up from people passing along oral tradition. They just wrote down the traditions with a minimum of kind of alteration for their context. I mean, I see the authors of the Gospels as creative theologians in their own right, and I think, you know, several decades of literary studies now have shown that that's not a ridiculous idea. I mean, you know, the Gospel writers can put a good plot together. They're clever in the way they put things together. So yeah, I do think we need a rather different end picture in terms of what the Gospel writers are doing with this material, but the sort of the general pattern, I've always been quite attracted to it. I mean, and one of the things that Brian is working on actually is this whole question about why it is that in Paul's letters you have so little on the historical Jesus, very little in the way of what Jesus said or did, and then suddenly by the time you get to Mark, you've got a whole load of stuff, and people always just assume that this synoptic tradition was just kind of, you know, poodling along quite happily in the background, that Paul wasn't interested for some reason, and that Mark just sort of wrote it all down. And I think Bultmann gives sort of more of a reason for realizing why that tradition might just not have been there for Paul in the 50s. You know, a lot of this hadn't been written, hadn't sprung up yet, and I think it's a good antidote to people who think that there's this unbroken line between Jesus and the Gospel writers, and the fact that he makes it far more complicated is a good thing, I think. But I do think, for me, one of the real difficulties with the historical, with the form critics, actually, is that they made it really complicated. And they used words like imaginary and myth and all of these things that, for me, one of the difficulties particularly is that they made it very difficult for ministers, preachers, to kind of talk about what people are doing in theological faculties. You know, how do you use this kind of thing in your preaching in a way that isn't just sort of odd? You know, how do ordinary people kind of make sense of this? I think possibly there could have been ways, but I think generally speaking, people just found it, either they didn't really understand it or they just didn't think that it had any sort of application. And I think that kind of created this gulf between what people do in the theological faculties and what people do outside in the churches. And even though I think very few people would actually go along with the full-scale form critics nowadays, and actually modern biblical studies is much more congenial actually to the kind of thing that people might be interested in churches, there's still been that big gulf, and I don't think, certainly in this country, I don't think it's ever really been kind of pulled back together again. And to me, it's particularly at the period of the form critics that you get that happening, and you get people thinking, well, what are they talking about? These are myths, and this is tradition from the oral period, and it's from the Palestinian, you know, how does all of that kind of relate to me sitting here? And so for all, you know, Bultmann was a dedicated Christian. I think for him the thing is that this doesn't really matter in terms of his Christianity, whereas for a lot of people it does, and then that becomes problematic. But then that's my own very personal take, I guess, on the form critics. I think church is still trying to work out how to deal with that.